Welcome to the World Bank Praxis discussion series. I'm Auskar Surbakti. I'd like to welcome our audience here in Sydney and those watching on APAC online and listening on radio, and to everyone watching in Honiara and Port Moresby. The global fish market is big business, worth almost $140 billion each year. Managing the world's fisheries, like many of our precious natural resources, is challenging and complex, driven by factors including territory, conservation, culture and revenue. In the Pacific, ensuring the long-term sustainability and viability of coastal and oceanic fisheries, both as a source of food and income, is a key challenge. Pacific Island governments are increasingly taking a regional approach to the management of these resources and are acknowledging the need to capture a greater share of fishing revenue while protecting the region's environment. But how can governments and private industry work together to ensure the sustainability of fisheries? Are there other ways Pacific Island countries can capture a greater share of the revenue earned from fish captured in their waters? And is regional cooperation between nations the best way forward? Joining us to discuss these issues are Transform Agora, CEO of the Parties of the Nauru Agreement Office, PNAO, Fisheries social scientist Kate Barclay, Associate Professor at the University of Technology, Sydney, and John Virdin, Ocean and Coastal Policy Director at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University. Thank you all for joining us. Transform, if I could first start with you, are you able to paint us a picture of what the industry is, who's involved in the Pacific, and how much is it worth exactly?
It's an interesting industry if you were a student of politics and economics, because the backdrop to this industry is that you have vessels from the richest and the most powerful countries in the world, European Union, China and Japan. On the one hand, United States, and then you have the small Pacific Island countries who control most of the tuna. And so it's the dynamics that this creates provides for interesting challenges. They're difficult because you've got rich against poor, small against large. And of course, I think the dynamics of it between ourselves is that we want to get a bigger share of these resources. Naturally, I think it's just the right question for us to ask. We, as resource owners, it's only fair that we have a bigger share and a fairer share of the value of these resources throughout the value chain, right from the natural capital where the fish is located, and hopefully in the retail and the marketing side of it. So our interest is in gaining control and securing rights to the control of the fisheries, but we're struggling against these powerful countries as well, who actually are there to also protect their economic interests.
And which countries would they be?
Oh, these are like the European Union, these are United States, these are Japan, these are China and Japan, Korea and Taiwan, the largest economies in the world. So as I said in my comment, it provides a very interesting backdrop to the way in which this resource is being managed, because it's an uneven playing field, as it were. But we have the resources, and therefore I'll talk about some of the things that we're doing to create value and some of the rights that we've been able to establish in the fisheries, particularly through the development of the vessel day scheme. This is the scheme in which days are allocated to each of the parties. And we've created a trading mechanism. We've limited, we've capped the fishing opportunities and days. And what this has done is it's actually created scarcity and it's added value to the resource. And I'm really happy to say that what has happened in the last 5 years, largely from the efforts of these small countries, we've been able to see an increase in the value of the returns that these countries are getting, from 60 million to around 350 million. And I think we're going up. But that's the value of rights-based fisheries management. And like I say to the powerful fishing countries, these are just lessons that we're learning from how, capitalism is, the whole idea of capitalism is based on rights-based private property rights. So we're just learning, and we're just simply applying the principles of capitalism that you apply to the development of your economies.
And John, you're a bit of an expert in the Pacific industry yourself. Can you just tell us how much does the Pacific account for in terms of the global fishing industry?
Sure. Well, this was one of the things I think that fascinated me so much about the industry and the tuna fisheries in the Pacific is over a third of the world's tuna is coming from the waters of Pacific Island countries. So this is a massive resource that you have here in the region that, really this is one of the main economic resources in the region, and how can that be providing more revenues for the countries, contributing more to economic growth, more to jobs and livelihoods, is one of the main questions that a lot of people have been wrestling with. And the way that these resources are managed directly contributes to that. How much fishing is happening, by who, when. And I think that's one of the things that's been fascinating to see over the last 5 years, as Transform mentioned, is that the countries have really come together and at least for one of the three main tuna fisheries in the region, put in place this essentially cap and trade type scheme that really limits the total amount of fishing to levels that are considered to be sustainable, and sort of leaving this asset or stock in the water to draw on it sustainably each year. And so I think it's a lesson for a lot of the world to learn, and a lot of the tuna fisheries around the world. I think there's a lot of innovation that's been happening here in the Pacific region.
And Kate, over the years, we've often heard about the balance between the economic benefits of the fishing industry in the Pacific versus the environmental impact. But what you've been looking at more closely is the social aspects of the industry. Can you just briefly explain that to us, and why really that's been sort of ignored over the years?
Okay, I guess probably the reason it's been ignored is that it's more easy to understand the economic need and also the ecological problems when you don't do something sustainably. But some of the social aspects could be, say, social impacts of industrial development, say around tuna ports or tuna processing factories. They might be an easy thing for people to understand, that there will be social impacts from social change and economic change and the kinds of jobs and bringing people together, and that's something that needs to be taken into consideration as well. For coastal fisheries, it might be that if you have an economic idea that's not based in local cultures and local political systems, that perhaps if you lend money for people to buy boats, that they will fish in a particular way, but actually in that place, because of the history of the way fishing's come about, they might fish in a different way. Well, that development project might not work because people might not use the boats in the way it was intended in the project. A social perspective can help draw it together, sort of look at local economies, look at the national political economy and the history perhaps of development projects and how people have come to relate to those. And you can help make things more effective and understand the way people relate as cultural and political beings to the natural environment and to the economic opportunities they're presented.
And we'll hear more about you hear the terms oceanic versus the coastal industry. So the oceanic is the bigger industry as opposed to the more smaller, locally based coastal industries. Is that correct?
Yeah, you can have smaller fishing companies as well engaged in tuna, but a lot of the tuna is sort of dominated by very large companies, whereas in this region most of the coastal fisheries are very small scale. There's not a lot of aggregation. They're locally run, and there's some markets that might be a little bit further away, but they're nearly always domestic or much even more local than that, to the local village or to a nearby larger town is where the product will be going.
Okay, we've heard about management, so let's talk about the regional bodies that exist at the moment to, I guess, protect the interests of Pacific Island nations in terms of their fishing industry. Transform, you're from one of those organisations. Firstly, tell us what your organisation is and how does that relate to the other bodies that exist when it comes to the industry?
Yeah, there's different layers of operations. You have, I'm from the PNA, which is a subset of the FFA membership. It's a smaller group, but
what does FFA stand for?
Or the Foreign Fisheries Agencies. This includes Australia, New Zealand, and all the other Pacific Island countries. But this is the group in whose waters almost 80% of the Western Central Pacific tuna fisheries are found in the waters of these 8 countries. And as John said, 30% of the global tuna that goes into the cans comes from the waters of the 8 countries. And
could you just briefly outline those 8 countries?
So these countries are the Federated States of Micronesia, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Nauru, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, Palau, Tuvalu, and Solomon Islands. And we have another, more recently, Tokelau, which is a territory of New Zealand, has become an important player. Their interest coagulates around the skipjack tuna and the purse seine fishery. So within the region, you have these different arrangements that are centered around different tuna stocks. So you've got in the South Pacific, the southern group, there's the albacore tuna, and then you have the broader group called the Foreign Fisheries Agency, which includes Australia and New Zealand. That is the body that coordinates and works. And there's a bit of history behind all these different organizations. But that was initially set up during the negotiations of the Law of the Sea Convention, in which the Law of the Sea Convention requires that all the bodies come together. So that includes the United States and all these fishing nations. But when we were becoming, independent, our leaders at the time decided that instead of going straight to set up a big body, we should have one in which we are able to develop our negotiation strategies and develop our fisheries. And so there is an overarching layer to the arrangements that we have, and that's the Western Central Pacific Tuna Commission, and that includes all the countries in the Pacific Islands, plus the fishing states. So that includes the United States, China, Japan, and the decision-making arrangements and the challenges that all these organizations face, I guess, differ. But the larger body called the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission provides the framework through which we can come together and at least talk, even if we don't reach agreements. And I think the jury is out there as to the effectiveness of that organization. We at least have an opportunity to discuss right across the broad range of the migratory range of the stocks. Where we have come in as the PNA is we manage the vessel day scheme, and we've now introduced we manage the fisheries so that we actually maximize the economic benefits. And so our interest is in economics. Our interest is in empowerment. Our interest is in ensuring that we get a bigger share of that, that 30% that I was talking about, that 80% of the catch that you get in our waters. Our interest is ensuring that, because we have, it's a different fishery that occurs in those waters. This is the purse seine fishery. These are the larger boats that use nets. And that's the fishery that supplies our canned tuna that you find in Coles and Woolworths.
So the purse seine boats?
That's the purse seine boats, that produce those. And our interest is empowerment. We want to make sure, we want to be able to participate in this fishery. And as I said, the vessel day scheme has been successful in terms of increasing the wealth. But
sorry
Yes,
to interrupt, we will. I will
Yes,
ask you
yeah,
more
sure.
about the vessel day scheme in just a moment. But before we do, John, can I ask about the whole social impact issue? Because you recently worked on a new agreement, the Pacific Regional Oceanscape Program, or PROP. Can you tell us how that worked and how you were involved?
Well, sure. This is a financing program that the World Bank is providing to a number of countries in the region to support better management of the fisheries. So it'll be a 6-year program of financing to countries who are interested to participate, starting with the first 4, Federated States of Micronesia, Marshall Islands, Solomon Islands, and Tuvalu, and then with some support at the regional level for some of the regional organizations that Transform mentioned, just to provide additional finance to help countries continue to strengthen the management of these resources, because the fisheries provide more benefits for the region if they're well managed, if the healthy fish stocks are a better resource and more valuable over the long term. So that's what the PROP, or the Pacific Island Regional Oceanscape Program, will be supporting, and that's just now getting started. It's been something that has been in discussion with the countries over the last couple of years, and it's now getting underway as a way to, again, to provide a little bit more resources to support what the countries are already doing and the innovations that are already taking place to help continue to strengthen those.
So it's not only to ensure a sustainable industry, but also so countries can better manage the revenue that they reap from the industry.
Well, I think this is one of the interesting questions that countries are starting to ask more and more now is, as the fishery is being better managed and countries are able to capture more revenues, charge more revenues for access to the fisheries, then there becomes the question a lot of governments are asking, okay, how do we translate that into more jobs and economic growth at home? So you're a Ministry of Finance and you might collect $10 million a year from the fishery, and now with better management that might be up to $20 or $30 million a year, and that's great. And then you're asking the question, how do you translate that? How do you invest that to create jobs at home? So that's an increasing question that I think a number of the governments are asking in the region.
Kate, we've heard about these various agreements and organisations that exist to support the industry, but are you seeing the benefits of those structures? Are the benefits from the industry filtering down to the communities?
I guess it varies from country to country, and some countries in the Pacific have richer tuna resources than others. Certainly jobs from onshore processing, or some of the countries like Kiribati have people going on the fishing boats. The money comes back and people have opportunities to do training, and you develop a sort of a human resources pool around these factories, because they employ thousands of people, the processing factories. And there are all sorts of technical jobs, and there are supervisory jobs that go with those. And a lot of the time they're based in rural areas or just outside cities, and they're providing employment opportunities and human resources training opportunities that might not otherwise be there. It also tends to be quite low paid work, the basic work in canneries, but I mean, I guess that's a problem of the economies in general, and you would hope that in future, as those economies develop, that pay standards go up in general, because they're at the minimum wage level. It's not only those jobs that are poorly paid.
And we mentioned earlier the oceanic versus the coastal industry, so the larger players versus the smaller ones. Is there a conflict between the two, or do they work hand in hand, or is there even a relationship between the two?
Transform may also be able to have some thoughts on this. So there's some synergies. So smaller companies can use infrastructure and freight networks set up by larger companies. Sometimes there's competition, though, over resources or over access. The Solomon Islands has an interesting situation. It's got locally based smaller vessels that have access to waters in between the islands, that the larger foreign vessels are not given access to those, to help conserve the stocks for the locally based ones.
But what have you heard, Transform?
I think there is a certain degree of interaction. I've been hearing from some of the local fishermen about reduced catches. it takes longer for them to go out. They have to go further away from shore, and so it's reduced catch rates. And some people are thinking that maybe it's due to the fact that there's a lot of large boats that are removing the fish from the sea, and therefore, you will have those interactions, I think, and we're seeing some of them in some of the communities.
And how is that being managed? Are we talking illegal fishing? Is it encroaching on a particular company's rights, for example?
I think what's happening is that I know that there is in Kiribati, some of the local fishermen are they've been complaining that their catches have been going down, and fishing actually has been. There's been a lot of fishing in Kiribati, and you do have. I suspect that maybe there is. These large commercial boats are removing a lot of fish from the water, and you're probably reducing the amount of fish that's available in the periphery towards the ocean side, the landward side of the islands. So I wouldn't characterize it as illegal fishing. I would characterize it as a result of the conflict that goes on between commercial fishing on the one hand and artisanal fishing on the other. So it's just like your recreational and commercial fishing in Australia, where you have those conflicts for space. So that I think that's you're just seeing those same kind of dynamics being played out. The issue really is one of food security, and whether or not that is having an impact on food security supplies at the grassroots level. And if it is, then maybe that's something that we need to our governments need to be concerned about, and look at some ways in which they can perhaps mitigate the measures, mitigate the impacts. I don't know what the answers are, but I think it does raise some issues that require some consideration.
John, do you see that as being an issue through your work in the industry? Is that something that we have to be concerned about?
Well, I think the food security issue absolutely is something to be thinking about. There's a number of interesting studies starting to come out in the last couple of years looking at what people think will happen with climate change and the impacts of climate change on the fisheries in the next 20 to 30 years. And the worry is that at the same time as maybe climate change may or may not impact some of these fisheries, and particularly coastal ones that supply so much protein for communities in many places, you'll have population growth over the next 20 years. And so there's a real concern for a number of countries that there may be a food-fish gap in some of these countries, and the coastal fisheries just may not be able to keep pace with population growth, and climate change may have an impact. And so there's an increasing number of experts that are starting to suggest, well, maybe we can actually help to move some of the coastal fishing communities into the tuna fisheries a little bit and start to give them a share of the tuna fisheries and a slice of the access to these resources. And some folks at Secretariat of the Pacific Community, the SPC, have really been looking at this, and I think it's an important issue.
Now, Transform, if I could now ask you about the vessel day scheme that you've touched on earlier. I'm just reading some figures here. So last year, the estimated revenue from the fishing industry was worth about $265 million US, but you say it could go as high as $450 million each year, perhaps largely in part to this vessel day scheme. Can you just explain that for us?
To me, it's probably one of the most interesting development stories in the Pacific, and I would think one of the successful ones in terms of what a small group of countries have been able to do largely on their own. And it's a story that I'm actually quite proud of, because when the Vessel Day Scheme, just to explain, it's at the beginning of the year, we come together and our countries decide on a total allowable effort, and then each one then gets a share of the days. And then they go out and whatever they want to do with the days, they sell it, they tender it. Some countries have tendered it, some have auctioned their days. But what I've seen is that because you've created limits, that's the other thing, is that there are hard limits in place, and therefore you've created scarcity. And so this Vessel Day scheme has created value. The scarcity has actually created value. So when we first started in 2010, the value of the total fishery, what the governments were getting in 2010 was only about $60 million. This is for all forms of the foreign fishing. And then we applied hard limits in 2011. And then in 2012, they introduced a minimum benchmark. And it wasn't easy because, you know, as you try and develop these arrangements, people have mistrust, they're not used to it, it's a new way. But now that, I think for this year, we've gone up from 60 million and we're climbing up to 350 million. And as you said, we will get to 400 million. And I know we will probably get to half a billion. And if conditions are right and all that, and I'm pretty optimistic. But the beauty about this story is that it's all been driven by a small group of developing countries, by a small group of, we have a very small office, without any donor funds. And that's something that I'm very proud of as well, that we have actually delivered to our members a fishery that's worth 350 million. That's if you want to think of the VDS, the value of the VDS today, in today's terms, it's probably the single most important shared natural resource that we have that can be valued, and in dollar terms. And all of this just largely from no funding, very little, no funding support. We managed to get some support from the World Bank and to do our crewing and our business plan, but largely from our own initiative. So it says something, I think, in terms of the direction that we have, and that's why I like to think that we are actually donors. And I know people don't like to see it that way, but the way I see it is this. You know, we're sitting on this huge resource that's worth billions of dollars. We've been able to, on our own initiative, extract 350 million and actually increase the value of the VDS through that initiative. But at the same time, you still see a lot of the resources being taken out. And who are the major beneficiaries of our resources? It's the rich, developed economies. So you're creating jobs in the United States, in Europe, in Thailand, in Korea, and all that. These are jobs that perhaps should be in the region to create jobs and opportunities, disposable income in the region. And so I say that, you know, we are probably one of the largest donors when you think of how our resources are being used to create jobs. Maybe if I'm also allowed to say that, one of the things that we've also looked at is we're not just happy with getting access. We wanna share in the whole value chain. And so what we've done also is we have created a marketing and retailing platform for Marine Stewardship Council. Many of you have probably heard of these eco labels, you know, sustainably caught tuna and all that. That's the language of the market.
So similar to, say, fair trade coffee,
yeah.
or single
fair
origin
trade
coffee,
absolutely, yeah.
palm oil-free products.
That's right. So we have in the fisheries, there are different labels, and we have the Marine Stewardship Council, which is probably the highest ranked. We subjected the Persane fad-free. This is the catch that's not associated with fish aggregating devices to certification.
Now, we should ask you to explain briefly what fish aggregating devices are. So obviously it's not a good way to catch fish.
It's not, but there are naturally, anything that floats in the water, like logs and even dead whales, tend to aggregate fish around them. there's no explanation. No, the scientists can't explain why fish tend to aggregate. But the industry has also been able to develop artificial fish aggregating, like floating devices. They put out all these fish aggregating devices out in the ocean. And fishing, it's to help with their efficiency. So they don't have to go out and look for fish. They even have satellite buoys on the FADs, the aggregating devices. And all they do is they sit behind and they look even at their headquarters. And they can send their boats to their...
And so now you're saying that the Marine Stewardship Council is working on developing an eco-label to identify.
We subjected our fishery not to that. We're saying that there is a component, fish that's not caught and associated with these fish aggregating devices. We would sell under the Marine Stewardship Council logo. And the whole idea is we want to be able to tell a story to the markets, that we have a product. And so we established a joint venture marketing and retailing platform called Pacifico. It's a joint venture between the PNA and a company in Netherlands, in which we're going to be selling canned tuna that's caught through sustainable methods, in which you are able to there's a code in which you can go through the internet, just like all these fair trade, and you can see the beautiful, pristine environment. It's a beautiful story to tell of the Pacific. And I think we have some orders from Coles for next year, so
we could see it on our
you will
shelves.
probably see it for the John West brand. Simplot, which is the company that supplies John West, have entered into an arrangement with us to provide fat-free tuna from Pacifico, from the pristine waters of the Pacific Islands, into the shelves in Australia.
That's fascinating. So it could be a unique selling point. But
it's a happy story.
On that note, we've just passed the halfway mark, so we'll come to your questions. But we've got one question here first from Papua New Guinea, addressed to Kate. So this person says, in PNG, of the 700,000 tonnes of tuna caught annually, only a tiny portion is processed in country. What opportunities are there to benefit more?
It's a tricky question, because the Papua New Guinea government, since the mid-90s, has had a policy of trying to make the international fishing companies process onshore, and there's quite a few factories who've done that. And so those companies are supposed to process onshore and value add and create jobs onshore in their factories. But still, a lot of even the fish. So there's still a lot going out. So it's a tricky question. I'm afraid I don't have the answer.
I could probably help with that. PNG has had the most investments probably in the world in terms of fishery, the establishment of canneries. But remember that a lot of these canneries are associated with plants in the Philippines, and there's one that's associated also with Thai Union, which is the largest producer. So, the total catch of tuna in PNG is 700,000 tons, but I think by design, some of those companies are actually taking out that fish, and they're not putting back enough fish to meet the throughputs and so that's an issue it's an issue for the PNG government. I know that the National Fisheries Authority is trying to take care of it and ensure that most of that fish gets processed. It's important that we process that fish in the region, and the reason is that it's in our interest to make sure that we process the fish in the region so that the prices are high. Thailand is our major competitor. Their interest is to maintain low prices. At low prices, the returns that we get, our canneries are not competitive. And so in some ways, PNG is probably digging its own heels by allowing that to happen, because they are undermining their own fishery, plus they're undermining the region generally in that they are allowing this fish to be taken out from the region and processed in Thailand, and Thailand's interest is in depressing prices. So it's if they can keep it here, that would ensure that we become competitive, because our processing plants, we can only compete with Thailand if the price of tuna is high.
Before we come to a question in Sydney, we've got a question to you, John, from Solomon Islands. Are there examples of best practice from other parts of the world that Solomon Islands can learn from?
I think there are a lot of examples of best practice, particularly in the coastal fisheries, and some of them are there in the Solomon Islands as well. There have been some good experiences where essentially in the current situation, governments and organizations have worked with communities to empower local communities to better manage these coastal fisheries, and then help them connect the products to international markets or value chains that might be appropriate. And there's been some of this in the Solomons already, and I think the push with the government to move towards community-based resource management of some of these coastal fisheries is keeping in line with a lot of the good experiences. I think when it comes to the tuna fisheries, some of the good practices and innovations are really right here in the region with the Vessel Day Scheme and what the parties to the Nauru Agreement, including the Solomons, are already doing.
Good to know. Okay, do we have a question from Sydney?
My name is Patricia Parkinson. I was working in the Pacific until recently, working with IUCN, the Environmental Law Program. One of the things that I noticed when I was working in the Pacific, mostly in areas of coastal resources management, and was the lack of connection between the traditional and customary system and the statutory framework. At the levels of the fisheries, to what extent do these various fora that have been organized to control ocean fisheries connect with the local communities? I mean, I know, for example, of the locally managed marine areas, which is a very good best practice example, and that's growing very quickly in the region, started in Fiji and now in lots of the islands. To what extent this sort of community representation is taken into account in these broader forums?
I think it's been recognised for some time by governments and the regional organisations that there's a disconnect. And quite a lot of the governments have been revising their fisheries acts and trying to make legislative frameworks that do better connect the need for community-based management. Because apart from anything else, particularly countries like PNG and Solomon Islands, customary tenure is normal. And so it has to be community-based, because these are the stewards and this is how people feed themselves and this is their livelihood. So there are attempts to make the legislative framework work better for that.
I think also there's some interesting ideas about how can you connect that into the tuna fisheries as well. Now that you have something like the Vessel Day Scheme, are there ways that governments can actually allocate some of that access directly to communities and give communities a direct stake in these tuna fisheries? And I think Tuvalu is starting to ask this question a little bit, and I think that's going to be a really interesting area to pursue in the coming years, so that you connect some of these communities directly into the tuna resources and the benefits that they're providing.
We've got another question from Honiara to Transform. What is P&A's biggest challenge and how do you plan to meet it?
We have just recently concluded I think a successful review of the Vessel Day Scheme. And
how long has it been running?
It's been first designed in 2000, adopted 2004, but really like up and running since 2007 and 2010. So just 5 years in terms of the effectiveness and what we're seeing. And so that review is going to inform us on the next 5 years to 10 years. Of course, there are issues with regards to managing relationships in all these cooperative arrangements, whether it's in the family or when you're dealing with governments that have different interests. So one of the issues that I'm seeing is the divergence of the economic interest surrounding the difficulties of trying to find commonalities. And the reason is that the common currency that countries speak of these days is the vessel day scheme. And so they are making so much more money now from the scheme that I think when we talk about designing other arrangements like looking at crewing and observer and all those, they become peripheral because governments generally look at the dollar signs that they make. So that's one. The other, of course, is that we have to constantly remain interested in sustainability of the stocks. And for that reason, we were largely responsible for pushing through what's known as limit reference points through the Tuna Commission. So we know where we don't want the stock to go down. But where we are now is that we want to maintain the stocks at a certain level that can deliver some of our different economic objectives like jobs and increased revenue. And that's where we have differences with Japan in that we want to have a target reference point, and that is where you want the stocks to be at 50% of the spawning biomass. Now what that means is the spawning biomass is the proportion of the stock that can reproduce, a proportion of a population that can reproduce. Japan wants to increase it. And that has economic implications. But the bottom line being that we are aware of where we want sustainability to be, and therefore we have been pushing very strongly towards the adoption of target reference points, because I think that's the best. It just makes common sense. It's the best way to manage your fishery. You can develop your harvest control rules. You set your objectives with recourse to these reference points. So yeah, those are, I think, some of the, but huge opportunities. I think for me it's not so much a challenge. It's the opportunity of hitting that $1 billion mark.
It's a good way to look at it. Do we have another question from Sydney? Sir? Yes.
Thank you. I'm Sanjeevi Rajasingham from the PRIF Coordination Office here in Sydney. Well, thank you very much. This has been a very interesting presentation. I have two questions. One is to follow up on this issue of sustainability and making sure that you're harvesting. What is the mechanism by which you enforce and monitor what fisheries and boats are doing? And the second question I have is about how have you got all these Pacific Island countries to work together to be able to have some kind of a uniform and consensual way to work rather than finding, gaming the system and finding individual approaches with specific fisheries. Thank you.
Yeah, on the first question, there is a very well established vessel monitoring system. So all those boats that are operating legally, you should be able to know where they're operating. Secondly, all the purse seiners, these are large purse seiners, cannot operate unless they have an observer on board. So physically someone has to be on the boat before they can fish. It's a bit harder to do that for the other boats, the long line boats, because those ones are smaller. But with information technology is so much so that we now develop information management system in which we require them to provide electronic reports. You can have catch documentation schemes, catch certification schemes that are all done electronically. And one of the small components of the World Bank, there was a sub-grant that we had. We've invested in information management systems to allow us to monitor in near real-time basis. Like I want to be able to, now you can almost go in and I can on my laptop basically view where fishing is taking place now. That's the power of the technology that we have at this point in time. On your second question, maybe someone, how do you get
Well, you could certainly answer better than I, but I do think this is, to me, the amazing story here is that that 9 countries have come together to cooperate and manage this shared resource. And it's hard enough for one country to manage a fishery sustainably, but for 9 countries to come together and do it, that's really, to me, the power of where the benefits have come from. And these countries have seen, since this has been introduced progressively, the benefits that they've gotten from cooperation. And to me, that's really the opportunity that lies forward. As long as the countries continue to stick together in managing this resource, then these targets all become possible.
And we have a long history of having worked together. So this one with the Vessel Day scheme is fairly recent, but it's the early 1980s that the parties to the Nauru Agreement this group of countries started cooperating specifically for improving the benefits from this fishery.
So you had a question?
Kirk Huffman, I'm from the scientific committee that oversees the Musée de Tahiti, the Seal Museum of Tahiti and the islands in Tahiti. And I'm with the Vanuatu Culture Centre as honorary curator and with the Australian Museum and Sydney Uni. Looking a number of decades into the future with possible climate change and possible sea level rise, and John was mentioning something about population rise in the Pacific, but with climate change and sea level rise, particularly with, for example, Kiribati and Tuvalu and some other and federated states from Micronesia, life may possibly become unsustainable in them a number of decades down the pipeline. How can what's the easiest and most secure way to protect their legal maritime boundaries so that if they have to vacate their nations and live elsewhere, they can still retain the rights to their maritime sea areas, and so that the stuff from the sea can be used to support them wherever they have to live, and also so they can retain their seat in the United Nations? That's important. Okay, it's a hard question, but it needs to be thought about.
I take the legal view that once the Law of Sea Convention doesn't say that if you disappear, you lose your territory. So I take the view that you still retain your territory, your exclusive economic zone, notwithstanding what happens. But that's my personal view, and I know that there's a lot of work that's gone into it. And how can you protect, with the development of information management systems, you can migrate the management of resources to another country using, if it's a web-based system, your data is all protected and all that. So you can continue to manage your fisheries from anywhere in the world, literally, these days. So I think the fact that your capital is not situated in sight doesn't necessarily mean that you can't manage your resource. That's my view of and that's why that's why I'm interested in this whole idea of moving towards these electronic systems for development of databases and information management systems, because of the possibility that you might lose that data. So you can still have Kiribati. I don't think we will lose that geographic area on the globe that's known as Kiribati. But having said that, there's literature out there, and there's people that are looking at it, and so I'm just expressing my view that you're not going to lose you won't lose, and so you can still have fishing in these waters that would be Kiribati's waters, would be Tuvalu waters. We should be. There's no reason why you shouldn't. And I would be surprised if the international community takes the position that these countries not only lose their land, but they also lose the geographic space that they have sovereign rights and rights over.
If we could move on to other questions before we wrap up. Kate, you might be able to answer this question from Port Moresby. What percentage of the benefit is kept in the region, and how is it used?
I couldn't put a finger on the percentage of the benefit, but having onshore factories and having jobs and also having fishing companies based in the region or owned locally is one of the ways to try and capture more of the benefit. So Transform talked about the value chain and the P&A's approach with the Pacifico to be moving into the retail and the branding parts of the value chain. Processing is another way of doing that. Certainly the majority of the value still goes out.
I think it's up around 10 to 13% of the first sale value is estimated to stays in the region.
Just 10%.
Well, it was 3 and 4% probably not too long ago. I mean, it's risen considerably, but yes, it's a small, because as Kate and Transform mentioned, so much of this value is being added to the products after they're leaving the region.
Offshore, right. Okay, do we have another question in Sydney? So,
my job in recent years has been to get companies like John West and Coles in Australia to turn to buying Pacifico fad-free tuna or pollen line, more sustainably caught tuna. And one of the biggest problems has been the availability of much cheaper tuna. You mentioned Thailand is the industry and government there presumably depressing prices. What options are available to combat that problem? Because I see it as one of the biggest challenges for tuna.
Well, we can try and control supply, limit the number of days, and as you've probably seen in some of the press releases, there's the World Tuna Purseaners Association have just met, and they're trying to cut back on about 250,000 tons of tuna, taking it out of the market by tying up. They think that by reducing and slowing down fishing by 35%, they may be able to do that, and therefore that should see the price go up. But we don't control what happens outside, and there's a lot of fishing there's fishing in the high seas, there's fishing in Indonesia, there's fishing in other areas that are also supplying the Thailand. So you have the bulge. In order to address, we only one component of the supply chain. You've got good fishing in Indian Ocean and so on. So.
I think there's also a role for organizations to play educating consumers as well, because there's a lot of times it's not clear to consumers what the different labels mean, what's a sustainable product versus what isn't, and I think there's still tremendous opportunity to continue to educate the marketplace as well.
Okay, we've got this question from Honiara. I'm not sure who might be able to answer this, but Pacific nations have now been issued 5 yellow cards from the European Union. Is this a shortfall of the Forum Fisheries Agency or their vessel monitoring system, or a heavy hand from the EU?
Well, I was just saying, taking a first stab and pass that over to others, but the EU has introduced relatively new regulations, let's say in 2010, that are aimed at preventing illegally caught fish from entering into their marketplace. So I think it's been a significant shift for a lot of countries in many places to now have to put in place the systems and the reporting that complies with that regulation. So I think you're seeing in a lot of places, countries are still catching up to this 2010 illegal fishing regulation that's been put in place.
Yeah, I think it's a wake-up call, and in terms of being able to it provides these countries with the impetus to improve fisheries management, improve their systems, and if you want to export to the European market, you have to meet those standards. But I think, overall, you want good systems to be developed, and as the EU, IUU regulations require, you need to have those systems in place. So,
do we have another question in Sydney?
Stephen Hartung from the World Bank. You have a vessel day scheme which actually controls the number of days, but that doesn't actually control the amount of fish that's caught, because obviously there's potential with increasing technology that fisher people are able to catch more fish in a day. How do you propose to approach that issue?
At this point in time, our strategy and the management regime is managing the fisheries by effort. So we're not quite there in terms of managing the fisheries by catch. But we have in the VDS review a recommendation that if we were to be able to, there's an extra additional millions of dollars that we might be able to extract from the fishery if we were to move into quota system and catch-based quota system. And so that is a piece of work that is to be done. And now also at the same time, you know, we've got the systems, we're developing the catch certification systems in place. To have a catch quota system, this is it's a mixed fishery. You don't have the same species of fishery. So when you're catching a school of tuna, you're not just catching skipjack, yellowfin, a bit of big eye. There's other bycatch as well. And so the issue with catch is what limits are you going to impose? If you're going to impose skipjack catch limits, then you have to have systems in which you're able to count literally the skipjack that you take. And I agree. I think catches, moving towards catch limits actually creates an opportunity for us, because jobs, if we do move into such a system, my policy response would be, I'd be happy to take that, but I'd require you to come ashore and you land your catch. We count the catch that you've taken in my waters and then take it back. But you create jobs at the same time. So there are opportunities for moving towards that as a fisheries management regime. We're just not quite there yet.
We've just got a few minutes left, and I've got a couple of questions around a similar theme from Papua New Guinea. Tuna stocks around the world have been overfished. What is the situation in the Pacific and how can we address it? Kate, perhaps we could start with you.
Okay, so there are lots of different kinds of tuna, and some are more or less resilient to fishing. So if the northern bluefin, southern bluefin, heavily overfished, but these are not the main kinds of tuna caught in the tropical Pacific. Skipjack is at the other end of the spectrum. It's a very resilient, as a species, it's very resilient to fishing and is not suffering overfishing. And then in the middle you have your big eye and your yellowfin that are suffering some problems, but they're not as bad as bluefin. And the Pacific has had less effort than other parts of the world. There's a smaller population, and so it's relatively more healthy, and it would be great to keep it that way.
I think you'll see, as this happens more and more around the world, that there will be more people coming to the Pacific. It's one of the last healthy fish tuna stocks in the world.
It's about preserving the integrity of that stock, I guess.
It's a tremendous natural resource for the region, and increasingly rare.
Okay, and we've got time for one last question from Sydney. Is there anyone who would like that honour?
Just a quick question about how are you considering the possible impact of deep sea mineral mining on the tuna and other fish resources? In particular, I understand around PNG, the areas that are targeted by deep sea mineral mining companies happen to be areas where there's the largest catch in tuna.
I haven't thought of the impacts as such in terms of your question. What we've actually given some thought to is the regulatory framework for deep seabed mining and how that particular activity can probably borrow from what the PNA has done by setting up a regional regulatory body that can set the standards, make sure that there's the environmental standards that these operators comply with. Currently there's none. There is good work that's being done in terms of supporting the countries to establish, develop regulations and legislation. But I think there's room, there's scope for the establishment of a PNA type arrangement. And I know within the PNA office, we've tried to share that to that particular forum that is looking at it. But on your question itself, I actually haven't given too much thought on it, because a lot of those activities, if they do happen, and we don't know yet because there's only one so far that has just been issued with a license. So really we're staring at the, we don't know what we're dealing with. They tend to be discreet, they tend to be stationary, and so we don't know. But we have to have
that's the important point right now, is that we don't know in many cases.
Interesting. On that note, we'll have to wrap things up, but can we please thank our panellists, Transform Agorau, Kate Barclay and John Virdin. I'd also like to thank everyone joining us either here in Sydney or from afar. And remember, you can view this or any of the other Praxis discussions at worldbank.org/Praxis. Until next time, I'm Auskar Surbakti. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.